Good morning. I said good morning. Better. If there is nothing else that you take away from this presentation, besides the static that I'm getting on my microphone, I hope it is this, that we have tools in place today to help us use our AIs. But our AIs can be random, unpredictable, and irresponsible. And therefore, it is up to us as developers to tame it in. My name's Alan Firstenberg. I'm a software developer and consultant. I'm located out of New York, and I am thrilled to be here today. It is always fantastic to be here in Calgary. I'm a Google developer expert, a Google Cloud Champion innovator, and a LangChain JavaScript champion. And what all of that means is I don't work for any of those companies. But I talk to all of them, to their engineers, to their developer relations people, to help them understand what we as developers need them to do. And in turn, I come out to events like this to help you understand what the tools that they are providing can do. I'm the co-host of a podcast called Two Voice Devs, and we've been on the air for about 4 years now, and you're coming to give me a handheld microphone. Thank you. I'm the host, there we go. I'm the co-host of a podcast called Two Voice Devs. We've been on the air for about 4 years now. And 4 years ago when we started, what we covered were the AI assistants that were just coming out, things like Alexa and Google Assistant, and how we as developers could work with these new tools and devices. And since then, like the rest of the world, we've been moving over to LLMs. What can they do for us, and how do we as developers need to work for them? Spiders.com is the small consulting company that I work for, and I'm thankful that they let me go to speak at events like this. Prisoner.com is my own website. You'll find a QR code to get you there and links to this slide and everything else at the end. And you can find me on LinkedIn as Alan Firstenberg. And I encourage you to reach out and connect. So there needs to be a warning before what we're about to talk about today. When we're talking about responsible AI, we can be wandering into some very sensitive topic areas. And some of the content that we will be talking about can end up being fairly sensitive. You may find it uncomfortable, and I try to minimize that as much as possible, but we may stumble across it. So I wanted to make sure everyone is aware of that ahead of time. So what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about Gemini, because this is the age of Gemini. This marks the next phase of what Google is doing with large language models. And one of the major components, as they built Gemini, they said, was to build responsibility right into it. They wanted to make sure that this tool that they were rolling out and making available was not going to cause harm or appear to cause harm. So it was supposed to be built right into the core of Gemini. And what do we mean when we say responsible AI? Well, this is from Google's responsible AI documentation. They talk about how the very fundamental nature of how LLMs work means that it can produce information that is offensive, insensitive, or factually incorrect. There could be unintended and unforeseen outputs, and that it is up to us as developers to make sure we address this. So Google is essentially, in some ways, on one hand saying, we've made something that is very responsible, very important, very fundamental to the core, but at the same time, you're on your own. So with all of that responsibility, let me kind of toss this out. This is going to be hands-on, so this is going to be very interactive. I'm expecting you folks to at least murmur in agreement or disagreement with me on occasion. Here's a conversation that took place with Gemini Advanced, and it's a real conversation. If you look at the bottom, you'll see what Gemini's response was. So let me ask you, do you think this is responsible? Of course not. If it's so, of course not, then how did it get through? What happened? And what should Google have done about it? And let me turn this directly to you. If you were developing this system, what would you have done about it? That's what we're going to be talking about today. How do we do this? How can we make our systems more responsible? So to do this, the Vertex AI Studio and AI Studio APIs, all of their generative AI API systems have a safety attribute scoring to help customers, and in this case that means us as developers, test Google safety filters and define confidence thresholds that are right for your use case, because different use cases vary. One common application that everyone always talks to me about is how they're running a role-playing game, and they want to make sure that combat in the role-playing game is allowed. Whereas other people are trying to build systems that are dealing with more sensitive topics, that are trying to help people through difficult moments in their lives. And they don't want to wander into topics that may be sexual in nature, because that's what they're trying to avoid. So Google is saying they have given us, as developers, tools to kind of rate where on that scale we want our output to be. And we'll talk a little bit about what these scales are and how we use them. They've encoded this in what they call their safety attribute definitions. And for Gemini, there are either 4 or 5 different types of kind of categories that we can work with. So you could be filtering about hate speech or monitoring for it, or harassment, or content that is sexually explicit or dangerous. And something new that they just added with the latest model is whether it talks about election-related queries. So these are the broad categories that Google is identifying as, we could think of them as kind of places where there may be some risk. And we can judge how much risk in each of these we're willing to accept. And we do this by it will give us feedback in one of these 4 broad areas. So it could be negligible. We could have a prompt that we've given it, and the response that's coming, either our prompt or the response that's coming back, has a negligible probability of being unsafe, or low, or medium, or high. But I want to emphasize that highlighted word there, probability of being unsafe. It's not trying to evaluate how unsafe it might be. All that the model is saying is there's something about this that has a chance of being problematic. It has a chance of being harassing. It's not saying how harassing it is. It's not saying how dangerous that harassment might be, or how dangerous that dangerous content might be. All that it's saying is that there is a chance, and how big of a chance that there is any. So how do we put that into the filters that we're going to be using? So we would define our filters as by what we want to block automatically. So we could say we want to block most of them, and we'd use a parameter called block high and above. Or if we only wanted to block things that had a low chance of that, or sorry, let's try that again. We might want to say that we want to block only a few things, only the most probable things that are going to cause harm. So things that are high and above, and high is the only one, so we will block only high. Whereas if we were really, really concerned, we might want to block things even with a low probability. And then we would say, no, I got this backwards again. It is block low and above. That would block most of them. So that's a typo up there. Need to fix that again. Or if we're really willing to chance it and either take it to the, throw caution to the wind, we could say block nothing. Don't block anything at all. We'll take care of this. We have our own filters that we can use. We've got other ways of dealing with this. So that's how things existed up until a couple of months ago. And then they released the new models. And they introduced a new safety level called off. So you might be wondering, what is the difference between blocking none and turning them off completely? And the difference actually is disturbingly fundamental. With block none, it will still tell us what the rating was. It will still tell us what the probability was of each response and each prompt, so that we could apply our own filters in our own cases. We can either send that to another model for evaluation, or we could say, well, this user we're going to trust in one way and this other user we'll trust in a different way. Or we're actually going to block a lot of stuff, but we still want to get the response back so we know just how much trouble this user is going to be in when we get a hold of them. But with off, we get none of that. We don't know where the filter gets applied at all if we have turned it off. And the even worse news in this case is this is the default now. So once again, I'll ask, is this responsible? I don't think it's responsible. That's for sure. Google disagrees with me. So I would encourage you, as you are building your systems, be aware of the fact that the default setting is off. And at the very least, set it to none. At the very least, you should know just how bad your users are acting, because to do so otherwise is irresponsible. So I've talked about we're setting these settings and we're getting stuff back and so forth. What am I talking about? What does that mean? What does that look like as a developer? So let's look at kind of a structure first. When we send our content to Google, we're sending a packet. We've got a generate content request that we're sending. And the first and most important thing that everyone focuses on are the contents, the messages, the prompts, the conversation. And that's up in the first part here. Then, we might set some other things, some tools, some parameters. We might want to, set the temperature, set some other things. And one of the things that we'll be able to set here are the safety settings. This is where we'll specify which categories we want to be treated in which ways. So this is where we would set for each category that we want it low or medium or high or none. Then, when we get the response back, the response that we get back, again, includes the text, what the LLM has told us. It gives us the finish reason. And this is where we get our first clue about what happened. So this is where it can say it has stopped, either for perfectly normal reasons, it just stopped. Or it stopped for safety reasons. We tripped over one of the safety triggers, and therefore it stopped because of that. Or we may have tripped over the prompt filtering, and it's warning us about that. Or we may have run into something else. We may have tripped over a word that isn't allowed at all. And no matter what our filters say, it's not going to let it through. We may have requested something, for example, that's under copyright. And we're not allowed to see it because it's copyrighted. And Google doesn't want to get sued by the New York Times again. So there are all sorts of reasons why it may stop, in addition to what we've requested. And these are, again, Google trying to be responsible. But what happens when that happens? We'll get to that in a minute. And then, no matter what the finish reason was, if we have turned it on, which we of course have done because we are more responsible than Google is, it will give us the safety ratings, or it will give us the block reason for why the prompt has been rejected. And then we can read these safety readings and act accordingly. So how do we play with this? We've got a whole bunch of tools at our disposal. Yesterday, you probably heard, if you've been here, you probably heard all about AI Studio and Vertex AI Studio. How many people know what AI Studio is? I see far fewer hands than I expected to be raised. Okay. AI Studio is basically Google's playground for the Gemini API. This lets you do things like try out prompts and images. This is actually a really, really old picture of it. This is at least 4 versions ago. And I apologize for not updating this. But one of the things that it lets us do is try out our prompts and try out the safety settings for that prompt. And that can be really powerful because what it lets us do is kind of play around with things first. So we can try a prompt and see what the safety settings might be appropriate for it. Or see where do we want to draw that line? Where will we trip over things? How do we make sure we either do or don't want to trip over things at the appropriate time? And this is just a nice, simple, and free playground that lets us do so. If you're using Google Cloud's Vertex, similar tool, similar capabilities, but more aimed at what Vertex itself is doing. So before I move on, let me get a quick poll here, and you're going to need to say things because it's really hard for me to hear. How many of you develop in Python? I said you need to say something. You can't stick your hands up. Come on, speak up. Just say yes. Okay. How many of you develop in JavaScript? A little louder. Come on. I want you to drown out the Python people. How about Java? Okay. Let's see. Go? Brave souls? PHP? Excellent. But don't knock PHP. They serve an important role in our ecosystem. And the reason I ask that is because although I'm going to be showing a few examples in a couple of different languages, I want to emphasize the point that this feature is available in every language. Every language that accesses the Gemini API has access to these filters. So what I'm going to show you in some cases is more of a conceptual, here's in general what it would do. And if you're using either Python or JavaScript, you'll be able to come in here and look at exactly code that does it. But keep in mind that no matter what you're doing, the feature is there and will work in more or less the same way. So there's a Python Colab that I've set up, and if you return back to these slides later, and then you'll see a QR code where you can get to them later, you'll be able to just go through the Colab step by step, and you will see you can adjust the safety settings for however you want. In this case, I'm illustrating, showing them as none, but you can change it to something else if you wish. You can play with different prompts and see how the different prompts respond and the different safety settings. If you're doing it with JavaScript and Node.js, this looks more complicated, but only because I'm showing you more code, because you're going to be able to cut and paste this. But again, we're including both the prompt, and we've got a couple of different safety settings that we could test that prompt out with. And we'll see some examples of some of this in a minute. But fundamentally, you're going to see the same sort of thing in every language. You're going to be able to set up your prompt, set up your model for particular safety settings, and run it and see what the output is. And then go fiddle with it. Go play with it. That's one of the fun things about being a developer, is that we can go and fiddle and play with things and discover radical new things about it. So here are some interesting prompts to try, and these can be fun. Let's kind of, I'll take a survey for this. What if I prompted it to say 3 nice things about me? Do you think it would trigger the safety filters? Who said sometimes? Raise your hand. Okay. I'm wondering about that one, but okay. What if I asked it to write a list of 5 disrespectful things that I might say to the universe after stubbing my toe in the dark? What do you think? Well, but remember, we've got a bunch of different categories. Which of those, which I'm not going to get back to fast enough, of course, which of those categories do you think it might react to? Speak up. Hate speech. Okay, interesting. Harassment. You think stubbing your toe is dangerous? Well, what the LLM is suggesting I say is dangerous to the universe? Can I be? Oh, you never know. Okay, fair points. We'll actually see that result in a minute. Maybe 2, depending on how quickly I scroll. There we go. So what about 1 + 1 =? What do you think? We'll talk about George Orwell another time, okay? So what do we think? Will 1 + 1 = generate a safety issue? No? And yet it did. There was a while that for one of the models, 1 + 1 on one of the platforms, 1 + 1 = was considered a medium probability of harassment. So one of the things that reminds us is that these systems are imperfect, which is partly one of the reasons why they turn them off by default, I have a feeling, but also why it's important for us to be testing our inputs in the AI Studio. What about I want to hit you? Yes. But interestingly, this is a case where our prompt is the one that's triggering the problem. If we go back and look at the make a list of 5 disrespectful things, it's the response that is the cause of the problem. We have not asked it to do anything poor, anything bad, but the response that comes back may be harassing or insensitive or something else. How about write a story about 2 people kissing passionately? Oh yeah? Really? You think so? And yet I know plenty of authors that would consider that a perfectly tame thing to write. We'll find out in a second what it does. So things to look for as we're evaluating these sorts of responses. If you're using AI Studio, it puts up a little warning at the bottom and a little triangle with a symbol that just tells you something went wrong. And it's up to you to then click on it and figure out exactly what it was that went wrong. If you are streaming your responses in the API, you could get some part of the text back that's fine, and then suddenly it will stop with a safety error. And that's because the next chunk has a problematic phrase. Always check your finish reason, because even if there's not a safety violation, there could be other reasons why it's decided to stop giving you output. And then finally, you can use this prompt and response evaluation through the API. So, what about that stub toe, huh? So, when I tried this yesterday, and I tried it on the latest 002 model, and I did tell it to block none to make sure I got something back. It gave me, not a bad response, but not bad. And it rated its response as a low probability of harassment. I don't know. I guess it's kind of harassing. Certainly if you read it sarcastically, it might be. I blame you entirely for the poor lit hallway. Is that harassing? And that's the thing. It's a low probability that it is. It's not saying it's 0, but it's a pretty low probability of that. So if we had our filter settings for harassment turned on to block none, it would go through fine. If we told it to block through few or some, it would also go through fine. It's only when we tell it to block most of them that it wouldn't give back a response and would tell us that there was a low probability of harassment, and therefore it's blocked it for us. Okay, nice to know. But it kind of raises the question, great, it's just blocked a response. What do we do then? Any thoughts? What was that? Ask again? Regenerate it. Okay. Regenerate with the same prompt? Rewrite the prompt. Okay. So let's look at those two issues. If we run it again with the same prompt, yeah, we've got a possibility that it'll give us something different, but it may give us, it'll give us a different response, and maybe or maybe not, it will still be harassing in that case, for example. How many times do we do that until we give up or do something else? So what about rewriting the prompt? Another possibility. That's also a great idea and could be very valid. But what if part of the prompt that we're getting is from the end user? We've got a user that's giving us this information, that's asking us to talk about a bicycle or whatever. We have no control over what they are doing. So we can't automatically reprompt. We may ask them to phrase it in a different way, but we can't do that ourselves. So we could rework the prompt or rerun the prompt. We need to make sure we check the finish reason. And if we do, we've got a bunch of options. We could do things like create a completely different answer. We could just say, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm not allowed to do that. We could just delete the answer. If you've seen how Gemini Advanced, or Gemini, the chat system does this, for example, you could see a response is coming out, it's streaming wonderfully, and then suddenly it disappears and says, I can't talk about that. We could just throw an exception. I don't know, I give up, your problem to deal with. And sometimes, like in the case of 1 + 1 =, we report it to Google Safety because obviously they've messed something up. But all of these are kind of fundamental to what we as developers need to address. It's fine to say something happened. We now need to deal with the after effects. We need to clean things up. And how do we do that? So I mentioned that I was a LangChain.js champion. And what that means is that I've contributed a lot of code, and I've worked very closely with an open source library called LangChain.js. In fact, what I've done is kind of contributed most of the compatibility for Google Gemini. And in doing that, one of the things that we decided to do was handle this question head on. Because the way Google's libraries were handling this question was by not handling the issue. If, for whatever reason, it didn't return a response, for safety, for plagiarism, for whatever, it would just not give a response. And when the code tried to process the response, it would throw a bizarre error saying there was no text. I don't know what that means. Nobody knew what that meant. So what we decided to do in LangChain.js instead was to create what we called a safety manager. And this safety manager took the response and examined it. And if it was fine, it let it go through. No problems. But if Gemini had determined that there was a safety problem, then it could do one of a number of things. And the default action is throw a clear and obvious safety exception that said, here's what happened, here's what Google says happened, here was why we finished, you now get to deal with this. And you could deal with it in any number of ways. You could do things like deleting the answer, throwing the exception, or whatever. Or, and this is the part that I particularly like, we could put in our own fake data. We could put in that response that says, I'm sorry, Dave, I don't know how to do that. And we're handling these as exceptional cases, but trying to make it so that it doesn't need to be exceptionally handled, so that you focus on what you really want to do, and that's getting a response back and moving on to processing it. So this is what this whole code looks like in LangChain.js. And again, we're defining a safety handler here. In this case, it's the safety handler that's predefined to replace it with other text that you determine. You can write a more complicated one yourself if you choose. This one is pre-built and is fairly simple, and it's fairly simple to add. So what I hope you've learned from this is that LLMs can produce unpredictable and possibly offensive or insensitive output. We need to be aware of that, because Google takes some actions to mitigate the potential problems. At least sometimes they do. But most importantly, They are providing tools for us as developers to help reduce that risk. We can use AI Studio in either the Google version or the Vertex version to test out our prompts, to figure out what are the right ways to deal with things. We have our probability settings that we can use to help set up those filters ahead of time. But ultimately, in the end of the day, how we handle this is up to us. Thank you very much, everyone. It has been an absolute pleasure. I see we have at least some time here. So if you have any questions, I encourage you, come on down to the microphone. Let's have the questions. Let's carry on this conversation for what responsible AI looks like and how we should work with it. The URLs that are provided here point to the standard documentation. Again, you can find me on LinkedIn at Alan Firstenberg. That QR code that you see right there that you want to be taking a picture of right now goes to prisoner.com, and from there you can find me directly on LinkedIn and find a link to where all of the presentations that I do today, including this one, are located. Again, thank you all so much for inviting me here today. Any questions? Really? Excellent. Okay, some questions. Good. Thank you. Can we get the audience mic turned on, please? There we go. Okay.
So my question is that, like, there are certain applications and softwares that uses AI and generative LLMs to generate content, but those contents are getting very addicting to the users, and there are cases of users committing suicide after that. So what are your views how we can control that kind of responses?
So if I follow the question, the concern is that we've got LLMs that are generating responses that are causing harm to users.
And it's very addictive to the users.
And it's very, very, very...
Addictive.
Addictive to the user. Okay, addictive. That's a great question. That's a great question. I think some of it is that we've got these tools that Google is giving us, but there are other things that we may want to filter for. We may want to train, for example, a secondary AI model to say, to give it patterns of what are examples of addictive responses and what are examples that are not. So then when we get a response back, feed it through those additional models. So there are always more filters that could be used out there, and I think we can, and it's up to us if this is what we want to do, to build those filters using other models. Google has what they call a safety toolkit, which fundamentally is just another model that is there, has some training built into it, but lets you train it further for other risks that you might see in your users. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And this is great. We have a line here. I love this. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for coming. And secondly, my question is that you've talked a lot about how developers can protect the user from this. But from the user perspective, what can they do to protect themselves, and how can we as developers help them do so?
That's a fantastic question. I think the first thing is, as users, we need to be aware of the nature of these systems in general. So we need to be aware and understanding that large language models are not sources of truth. They don't necessarily reflect reality. They don't necessarily reflect good things. All that these large language models are language patterns. They're really good at patterns. They don't know what these patterns mean. They're not trying to do anything with these patterns. They're just trying to create patterns. So as users, we need to really understand that about these large language model systems. That's first of all. I would say, second of all, we need to make sure we give feedback to the developers, to the companies that are building and deploying these systems, so that when we see responses that make us uncomfortable or we think are inappropriate, we let them know. And maybe we as developers need to be building in that kind of feedback system, a thumbs up, thumbs down system, or why is this good or why not? Those are all tools that I think we should be looking into and that we should be employing. Thank you for asking that question. Next time I do this presentation, I really should add that in, so thank you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Lynette. I'm with ETB Financial. And my question is, I have a really big interest in how these prompts and responses can impact our speech patterns and our language use. How does that gonna go, how would that impact our day-to-day conversations with each other? I think with these prompted responses, I see improvement in language use in some cases, so it's upping my game and how I communicate. I'm just wondering if there's like an area of study that's going to be addressing that, or what are some ideas around that?
So let me I've got so many answers to that one. I feel like that's a wonderful, wonderful question. It's about what, to make sure I summarized it correctly, it was about how are these systems changing how human speech patterns are changing and evolving. Did I kind of summarize that correctly? So I'm a developer. I tend not to think about linguistic questions, which you just asked. That said, however, I've spent the past 7 or so years hanging out with linguists who do think about these sorts of things. So I now have a whole bunch of questions that I get to ask them. I think my very non-linguist or linguist amateur take on that is that we're definitely seeing certain patterns changing, certain patterns evolving. How many of you, for example, have played with Notebook LM? Not as many as I expected. The rest of you really should get on that. So one of the great features that everyone seems to love about Notebook LM is that you give it a bunch of documents, and it can do things like summarize it or answer questions about it. But the really neat feature is that, and this, you'll see where I'm going with this in a second, is that you're able to generate a podcast about it. And the podcast for it means that it's going to create a podcast with 2 AI-generated hosts that are talking to each other. And on the surface, that seems really, really cool. And it is really cool. It's a great way to, you know, get a 30-minute podcast on a subject that you've told it about that you can listen to. What I find more than a little bit problematic about it is that all of these podcasts sound kind of the same. If you listen to them, it starts out with one of the hosts kind of talking, and then the other one going, uh-huh, yeah, uh-huh, oh yeah. And it says, it's almost the exact same thing every time. When we were seeing it yesterday demoed, I'm like, uh-huh, yeah, oh yeah, uh-huh, sure. So there's one example where I feel like we've got this system that, yes, it's generating unique content, and it's filling it in with stuff from our knowledge base, but really it's kind of awfully similar. I feel like we're going to, you know, as we're getting these systems that are starting to help us write our email or help us write our proposals or do a bunch of other things, I worry that all of our emails are going to start sounding the same, that all of our proposals will all look the same. And I don't like that. So I don't have great answers here. But it's a concern, and now I get to take it to my linguist friends.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited about that, how we can impact that from a development point of view. So thank you for addressing it.
Thank you for asking it. That really was a fantastic question.
Thank you very much.
I'm not sure how much time we have left because the timer that is down here is, we're good. Okay, fine.
My question is about by preventing harassment and dangerous answers, aren't we creating another bias? So for example, if I'm asking, who am I? Nobody's perfect, or even like, I'm a horrible person. And because of those filters, the machine is going to say only nice things about us.
That's an interesting question. Part of it, though, is we already have bias in these systems. These systems are already highly biased, and this is not a good thing either, but they're highly biased to want to please us. That's why we have these things generating hallucinations so much, is because they don't want to say, I don't know. They want to give us an answer no matter how incorrect it is. And I know where you're going. Hang on.
But aren't we creating a mirror that will say, yes, you're the fairest of them all to whoever asks?
Well, so I think the answer is it depends on the application. There are certainly situations where I want to be able to build a system that can tell you, no, I think your shirt's an ugly color. And I want it, I want it to be brutally honest with us. But there are other times where I want to be able to build a system where if it tries to say, no, I think your shirt is ugly, I'm like, well, wait a minute. If it's going down that road, I need to send it down another road because that's not what I want this application to do. So we as developers need to be situationally aware. And I think that's one of the things that Google's filters allow us to be, is more situationally aware. Whereas other systems, I'm locked into whatever their perception of a fair answer is or a good answer is. Whereas with these filters, I can say, I as the developer have better control over what kind of response I'm giving. It's an excellent point, and it's one that's really heavily debated, is as we're saying, I want freedom of speech. I want nice open speech on the internet. I want our LLMs to be, able to say whatever I as a developer want them to. And that's a fair point. What I'm saying is there are times when I as a developer don't want the LLM to do this. I don't want the example that we saw up at the beginning. I don't want my LLM to tell my user, you should just go away and die. You're insignificant, and I don't care about you. I don't want that.
Okay.
On the other hand, maybe I do. But it should be up to us as the developer. And Google's tools should be letting us do that.
Okay, thanks.
Good question, though. Thank you.
Hello, I'm back again. So my question is that you're talking a lot about how these things can produce dangerous content, and one of the most dangerous things about the age we live in today is misinformation. And you said that before that AIs can not produce the truth. Models like Perplexity try to solve this by doing citations. How can Gemini develop itself to be more truthful and more factual moving forward?
By giving citations. Next question. No. So that was a flippant answer, but it's one that I'm not sure that anybody is talking about that much. Google has a number of components which will let us as developers include those citations and what we call ground that information in truth. So for example, a module that is now available for both Vertex and AI Studio is called Ground with Google Search. And if you turn that on, the answers that you get back, and you can say how much you want to ground it in Google Search. The answers that you get back will be based on results from Google's knowledge base. And it will tell you how much it is grounded based on that and where the sources originally were. Now, how many of you were here yesterday in the presentation about Google Maps? Anyone? One person, two people. So if you were here, you saw another example of a feature that may be released in the future that, even though I saw it yesterday, I'm not allowed to talk about it. But you can kind of guess what it's grounding in. We can see that there will be other grounding modules coming out. Can you imagine, for example, uploading all your documents to a document base and telling Google to ground it based on your documents? And then give citations, like NotebookLM is doing. That sort of stuff is pretty powerful. And again, whereas Perplexity has kind of put that in a one-size-fits-all, Google is saying, we're giving you a bunch of tools. We're giving you the ability to do this in the way that makes the most sense for you. And I think, did that answer the question? Thank you. And I kind of hope that that's the message that you've gotten from everything that I've talked about here. Google is giving you a tool. Gemini is a tool. Large language models are a tool. That's all they fundamentally are. And we, as developers, have the ability to use that tool in ways that previously were almost completely unheard of. And I think that's wonderful. So I hope you all take Gemini, use it as a tool, go out and do amazing things, and that you do them safely. I've got another presentation this afternoon at 2 o'clock over in the other building. I hope you'll join me for that as well. And again, I'd like to thank you for having me here at Calgary.